There comes a moment when noise stops feeling like stimulation and starts feeling like pressure. Not loud noise, constant noise. The kind that never leaves space between thoughts. The kind that tells you who you are before you've had time to notice who you've become. Most people mistake silence as absence, as retreat, as weakness. But silence is not empty. It is directional. It does not remove you from reality. It removes reality's grip on you. Silence unsettles because it interrupts momentum. Systems, social, psychological, ideological, depend on continuity. They need the next input, the next reaction, the next signal to keep you moving in familiar loops. Noise reinforces those loops. Opinions, notifications, expectations, commentary, all of it keeps the machinery warm. Silence, by contrast, lets it cool. And when the machinery cools, its structure becomes visible. This is why silence is often misread as withdrawal. From the outside, it looks like disengagement. Internally, it is the opposite. Silence is an act of reorientation. When external stimuli recede, the mind loses its borrowed scaffolding. It can no longer lean on scripts. It must either collapse into discomfort or begin constructing its own order. That moment, when nothing tells you what to think next, is where real psychological activity begins. Control systems understand this intuitively. They fear silence, not because it is rebellious, but because it is unregulated. As long as commentary continues, behavior remains predictable. Even dissent can be managed if it follows known patterns. Silence breaks that predictability. It introduces gaps, and in those gaps, contradictions surface, not dramatically, quietly. A belief you've repeated for years suddenly sounds unfamiliar. A reaction you assumed was natural begins to feel rehearsed. You don't argue with these realizations. You notice them. This is the distinction most people miss. Silence is not for judgment. It is for observation. Judgment requires a framework, usually inherited. Observation requires none. In silence, you are not correcting yourself or improving yourself. You are watching yourself. Watching the rhythm of your thoughts, watching which ideas return when nothing invites them, watching which anxieties dissolve when no one reinforces them. At first, this feels disorienting. Without external cues, the mind reaches outward, searching for instruction. It wants to fill the quiet with familiar voices. This is not a failure. It is exposure. You begin to see how often your inner world has been outsourced, how many of your certainties arrived pre-packaged. Silence doesn't accuse you of this. It simply reveals it. Over time, something subtle shifts. The mind starts generating its own continuity, not opinions, patterns. You recognize which thoughts feel native and which feel implanted. You sense the difference between urgency and importance. You notice how certain impulses only survive in company, while others remain steady in isolation. This is not enlightenment, it is calibration. Once this calibration occurs, external control weakens, not because you resist it, but because it no longer has leverage. Control relies on immediacy, on reaction, on the assumption that you will respond before you reflect. Silence stretches time. It inserts a pause where influence expects compliance, and in that pause, influence loses clarity. A person who can sit with their own unmediated cognition becomes difficult to steer, not defiant, just opaque. Their reactions are no longer automatic. Their attention is no longer available on demand. They do not need to announce this change. It expresses itself through restraint, through fewer explanations, through decisions that no longer require consensus. This is why silence is often framed as avoidance or emotional shutdown. Those interpretations protect the status quo. They pressure you back into expression before internal coherence forms. But true withdrawal is unconscious. Silence, when used deliberately, is awake. It listens, it waits, it allows internal structures to reorganize without interference. Eventually, you realize silence was never about disappearing. It was about returning to a mental environment where your thoughts are not immediately shaped by response, where your identity is not continuously negotiated, where your sense of self does not depend on being mirrored. When you leave silence, you don't become louder, you become precise. Words regain weight because they are no longer compensating for noise. Attention becomes selective. Presence becomes deliberate. And those around you may not understand what changed. They will only sense that something did. Silence does not announce its effect. It settles it. And once settled, it doesn't need reinforcement. It remains quietly. Reordering everything that comes after freedom is sold as relief because relief is attractive. It promises ease, clarity, and emotional payoff. But that version of freedom is curated for consumption, not lived experience. Actual freedom removes structure before it provides strength. It strips away systems that once dictated behavior, identity, and meaning, then offers nothing to replace them. No applause, no reassurance, just space. And space, when you are not used to it, feels like a threat. When control systems dissolve, whether they are external rules, internalized beliefs, or social frameworks, the mind enters a phase of instability. This instability is not a flaw. It is the absence of scaffolding. You are no longer being held in place by expectation. There is no script telling you what is acceptable, no authority confirming that you are doing it right. The nervous system interprets this as danger because for most of human conditioning, structure equals safety. Even harmful structure feels safer than the unknown. This is why freedom initially resembles loss. You lose certainty before you gain direction. You lose identity before you develop authorship. You lose validation before you develop internal coherence. Many people retreat at this stage, not because they are weak, but because discomfort is misinterpreted. The mind labels uncertainty as failure and seeks to correct it as quickly as possible. It rushes to replace one system with another belief, another group, another ideology, anything that restores the feeling of being held. This pattern is well understood in psychological deprogramming. When individuals exit rigid systems of belief, the most dangerous moment is not resistance, but emptiness. The absence of instruction creates anxiety. Without careful reframing, that anxiety pushes the person back toward familiarity, even if familiarity was the source of control. Successful deprogramming does not rush to fill the void. It teaches tolerance for it. The discomfort is not treated as a warning, but as a transitional state. That tolerance is not natural. It is learned. The mind is accustomed to movement, to reaction, to certainty. Stillness feels like stagnation. Uncertainty feels irresponsible. But freedom requires a period where answers are suspended, where identity is not asserted, only observed. This is not empowerment. Empowerment implies energy, momentum, outward expression. What develops here is quieter. It is steadiness. Over time, something subtle shifts. The need to be told who you are begins to weaken. You stop scanning the environment for cues about how to behave or what to value. Not because you have found better answers, but because you have learned to sit without them. This is the moment agency begins to form, not as excitement, but as grounded presence. You are no longer performing coherence, you are building it internally. This phase often feels unproductive from the outside. There are no visible achievements, no declarations of independence, no dramatic transformations. Internally, however, a recalibration is taking place. The nervous system is learning that uncertainty does not equal annihilation. The mind is learning that identity does not need constant reinforcement to exist. You are not becoming louder. You are becoming less reactive. What emerges from this process is not a new label, but a new relationship with yourself. You begin to notice patterns without immediately defending them. You observe impulses without obeying them. You recognize discomfort without assigning it meaning too quickly. This observational capacity is the foundation of real autonomy. It is impossible to be controlled in the same way once you can see yourself clearly without judgment or urgency. Freedom, then, is not the absence of constraint. It is the ability to remain intact when constraint is removed. Most people never reach this stage because they mistake the early discomfort for regression. They assume freedom should feel like confidence, when in fact, confidence is the byproduct of having endured uncertainty without collapsing into it. Once this process begins, it rarely reverses, not because it is irreversible, but because something fundamental changes. You stop needing permission to exist as you are. You stop outsourcing meaning to structures that promise safety at the cost of self-authorship. The mind, having learned to tolerate openness, no longer rushes to close it. And that is the quiet truth most narratives avoid. Freedom does not arrive as empowerment. It arrives as exposure. If you can remain present through that exposure, without rushing, without replacing, without retreating, what follows is not excitement, but clarity. Not certainty, but stability. And that stability does not announce itself. It settles. It stays. There is a moment that rarely announces itself. No collapse, no rebellion, no dramatic turning point that others can point to and say, "This is where it began." Control usually ends much more quietly than it begins. It fades not because it was fought, but because it stopped working. What most systems depend on, whether social, ideological, or psychological, is not strength, but predictability. They don't need you to agree forever. They only need you to react on time. External control feels powerful because it appears constant. Rules, rewards, punishments, expectations. These things surround you so thoroughly that they begin to feel like gravity, unavoidable, natural. But gravity only works if you continue to fall in the same direction. The real vulnerability of any system is not rebellion from outside, but regulation from within. The moment you begin governing your own attention, your own emotional responses, your own interpretation of events, something subtle shifts. The system doesn't break. It simply loses leverage. Most people assume freedom looks loud. They imagine resistance as visible defiance, arguments, exits, declarations. But long-term control is not defeated by noise. Noise feeds it. What weakens control is silence paired with precision. When you stop reacting automatically, when your emotions no longer arrive on schedule, external pressure becomes inefficient. It still exists, but it no longer produces the same results. The same stimulus yields less response, less fear, less urgency, less compliance. Over time, the cost of maintaining control rises, and systems are not built to sustain effort without return. Internal self-mastery is often misunderstood as discipline imposed through force, but that is just another form of control, turned inward. True self-mastery is not rigidity, it is regulation, the ability to notice an impulse without obeying it, to experience an emotion without outsourcing your behavior to it, to hear a narrative without immediately accepting it as truth. This capacity does not require constant effort. In fact, it reduces effort. You are no longer dragged by every internal fluctuation, and because of that, nothing external can reliably pull you either. This is why structures that rely on obedience rather than understanding fear this state, not because it is aggressive, but because it is uncooperative in the most inconvenient way. A self-governed individual does not need to be silenced, punished, or persuaded as often. They do not escalate. They do not radicalize. They simply stop responding where a response is expected. Control mechanisms depend on feedback loops. When those loops weaken, the system cannot tell whether it is winning or failing, and uncertainty is expensive. Self-mastery does not announce itself. There are no symbols, no slogans, no outward signs that make it easy to identify. From the outside, it can look like compliance, or apathy, or patience, but internally, something fundamental has changed. You are no longer managed by urgency. You are no longer captured by emotional bait. You are no longer compelled to interpret every event through the frame that is offered to you. This is not liberation in the romantic sense. It is sovereignty in the practical one. Over time, external systems attempt to adjust. They increase pressure. They refine messaging. They try to provoke stronger reactions. But each adjustment reveals the same problem. Control requires participation. It requires that you internalize the rules, the fears, the incentives. Once you stop doing that work for them, control becomes labor-intensive. It must be enforced manually, repeatedly, without guarantee. Most systems are not designed for that. They are designed for scale, not precision. What remains after this shift is not opposition. Opposition still grants relevance. What remains is independence, and independence is devastating because it cannot be argued with. It does not need to win. It does not need validation. It simply operates on a different axis. The system continues, but you are no longer aligned with its emotional rhythm. You move at your own pace. You respond when necessary and not when expected. This is why long-term control always fails against internal self-mastery, not because self-mastery is stronger, but because it is quieter. It does not seek to overthrow. It does not seek to expose. It does not seek to dominate. It withdraws its energy, and without that energy, control has nothing to bind to. What's left is not rebellion, but irrelevance, not resistance, but detachment. And in that detachment, something settles, a clarity that does not need to be defended, a stillness that does not require permission. The world continues to apply pressure, as it always has, but pressure only shapes what yields. When nothing yields, pressure eventually dissipates, not in a moment, not dramatically, but inevitably.